So we have some news to talk about that came out a little bit earlier today, and it came out here from Matt Schneidman, who said this: quick housekeeping note. Joe Barry's contract is not expiring, according to a source. Matt LaFleur has yet to make a decision on the future of his offensive coordinator, but it would be a firing and not a decline to renew if he moves on from Barry. So a little bit earlier in the season, when the Packers were struggling mightily on defense, when we had that really bad stretch of games against the Giants, the Buccaneers, the Panthers, there, of course, was a lot to talk about the Packers potentially firing Joe Barry before the season ended. Matt LaFleur decided to stick with Barry, and things definitely took a turn for the better in the end of the season and in the playoffs as well. But when you look at the fact that he actually is not, his contract is not expiring, which I think was a common idea, that the Packers had signed him to some kind of 3-year deal when he joined Green Bay, and either they signed him to a longer deal when he initially came to Green Bay, or at some point he got an extension. There's not really information out as to exactly his contract scenario and what's going down there, but we do know now from Matt Schneidman that if the Packers were to make a change at defensive coordinator, they would actually have to fire Joe Barry. And so now the question is it a good decision? And do we think Matt LaFleur is going to do it? And if you guys have been watching my channel for a couple months now, during that period of games when the Packers defense could not stop really bad quarterbacks like DeVito and Bryce Young, at that point, I was like, okay, I'm ready to move on from Joe Barry. I think that when you see this consistent failure here against lower-tier quarterbacks, it's just something that can't happen. After the Cowboys game, I was starting to contemplate, well, if this is how the Packers defense responds and they play as well as they did against the number one scoring offense in the NFL, I was ready to contemplate changing my mind. And then to see what we did against the 49ers, even though it wasn't perfect, I honestly think it was a really, really solid performance by this Packers defense. And when you look at the fact that the 49ers, one of the most explosive offenses in the NFL, they were missing Deebo Samuel because of his injury. But to hold him in check a majority of the day, and to do what they did against the Niners and be in that game the whole time, I honestly think that Joe Barry has done enough to stay here in Green Bay. And I'm honestly pretty neutral when it comes to him staying or him leaving. Before, I was definitely on the let's move on from Joe Barry train. But the fact that this Packers defense is playing competitive football against some of the best offenses in the NFL makes me slow down the idea of moving on from Barry, just because, I mean, I think at any point you're going to have some struggles and some moments where your team isn't playing well. But then if in the final stretch of the season, that's when things start clicking, and that's what's happened with Barry last season and this season, it's like, okay, well, if you can come in these big games and the defense can have performances like this, I think this is a formula that the Packers can use to find success going forward in the future. And who knows exactly why things turned around. I think that you have to factor in Jair Alexander coming back from being injured in a suspension. You have to factor in the fact that through lots of the season, there were tons of young players out there in the secondary. You have Joe Barry having to figure out after the Rasul Douglas trade how to mix in Carrington Valentine, Corey Ballantyne without Jair Alexander there. And to see what the Packers defense did against the Cowboys first off, and then honestly how well they played against the Niners, I would be fine if Joe Barry stays around. And that is a switch up from what I was thinking a month and a half, 2 months ago. But I think that we think, well, if we just move on from Joe Barry, things will get better on defense. Is that possible? Yes, of course it is. Maybe a new defensive coordinator switches things up a little bit and, brings some new life to this Packers defense and takes them over the top. But the fact that this season, the Packers had the 10th best scoring defense. And so while I know lots of the advanced metrics don't like the Packers, they're bottom 10 in lots of those advanced metrics. When you have the 10th best scoring defense in the season, you play really good defense against the best scoring offense in the NFL in their first playoff game, and then you almost do enough to beat one of the best teams in the NFL in the 49ers if we don't miss that field goal, if the Packers maybe convert a couple of those or even one of those red zone opportunities early in the game, the Packers win that game. And so I would honestly say the offense was more at fault in this game against the Niners than the defense. There were a few missed opportunities by the defense, 2 of those potential interceptions that did not come to fruition from Savage and Nixon. But I would say that special teams and the offense was more to blame later in the stretch than the Packers defense. I do think, I can look at the final drive where the Niners drove down the field and scored when the Packers needed to stop. Packers couldn't get it at that point, but all day long they played pretty good. For most of the day, contained Christian McCaffrey. He ended off with some nice plays. But all in all, I think when you look going forward to the future, Matt LaFleur is going to want to try to keep this team as much intact as possible. And, looking back now with what the Packers were able to do, the decision to stick with Barry seems smart, because if they would have moved on from Barry like I even wanted, you bring in a new defensive coordinator, and maybe the Packers don't make the playoffs. Maybe they don't play as well as they did in the playoffs against the Cowboys and Niners if they have some new defensive coordinator in there who's bringing in a whole new scheme. So I think Matt LaFleur was smart in that moment to make that decision, and I was probably wrong at the time to say, let's move on from Barry, because things turned around. And even if next season, let's say Barry comes back, and the Packers have a stretch of games where things aren't going well. It happens with any team. I fully get that. But if Joe Barry can do what he's done the past 3 seasons, which is in the final stretch of games, the Packers defense, for whatever reason, turns it up a notch. You look back to Barry's first year, they make it to the playoffs. They lose to the Niners, but it was no fault of the defense. The defense played lights out. They held the Niners to only 1 touchdown. The other point was from the blocked punt return for a touchdown. And then last season, we missed the playoffs, but the defense played really well down the stretch. This season, the Packers defense turns it up the final few games of the regular season to make the playoffs, and then plays pretty solid football against 2 of the best offenses in the NFL. So I don't think removing Barry is going to solve these problems. Would I be upset if the Packers moved on from Barry? No. I'm sort of neutral on this, because I think that if Matt LaFleur, whatever decision he makes that he thinks is in best interest of this team, if he thinks that the defense is better moving on from Barry, he's going to make that decision. If he doesn't, he's going to stick with Barry. And from what we've seen, I would not be opposed. But those are my thoughts. If you want more Packers content, feel free to subscribe down below, and I'll see you guys next time.